Hi, my name is Mark Harrison. I'm a clinical oncologist based in the United Kingdom. We've been very kindly asked by the ACF to discuss uh, current UK trial, which has just reported, which is part of the trials, which is part of the PLATO umbrella. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take you through, using the slides, the current situation within the United Kingdom, where we've been able to do what we've done, and the results from our first trial. So the UK has always had a strong and active engagement in the management of anal cancer. And you can see from the slide that I'm demonstrating, there have been a number of trials, initially starting in 1990, back in 1996, again in 2013. And more recently, there was the design of what they call an umbrella study, known as PLATO. And within that were a series of specific studies designed to look at different stages of anal cancer. What I'm going to talk about today is the first of these studies to have long-term results. That's Act 4. But we can also discuss, perhaps in the future, both Act 3, which looks at very, very early disease, usually post-surgery, and Act 5, which is more involved with the management of advanced disease. So, as you're aware, any trial of this nature takes a large number of people. And what you can see here is the trial team, both the statisticians, the data management, the trial management, as well as the clinicians involved. It's a complex area which requires a significant number of people to make sure that the outcome we get is both accurate and fair. The trial asked the question, do we need to give people with smaller anal squamous cell carcinomas the same dose of radiotherapy as those with more advanced disease? Studies until the beginning of PLATO had effectively used the same dose and dose of radiotherapy and chemotherapy throughout. Act 4 asks the question, for smaller tumors, can we give a lower dose of radiotherapy while keeping the effectiveness the same and possibly reducing longer-term toxicity? The primary endpoints for the trial were local regional failure. So that is whether or not the disease relapses either locally or nodally within the pelvis, with important secondary endpoints looking at both acute and late toxicities, the response rate, the disease-free and regression-free survival, as well as overall survival. And very importantly, in something which is fundamentally quite patient-derived, how the patients themselves report the outcomes from the treatment, so PROMs, patient-reported outcome measures. There are a number of centres within the United Kingdom who recruited well, and this shows the distribution from Aberdeen in the north all the way down to Exeter in the south. In general, our demographics were the same as any other anal cancer trial at this stage. There was a preponderance of ladies or women to men, about approximately 75 to 25%. The median age was in the mid to late 60s, and again, that would fit within the normal population. So, what we've done here is designed a trial. We've asked a question, and the moment of truth is whether or not our primary question, local and primary endpoint analysis, or whether or not local regional failure is decreased within the group who got the reduced dose of radiotherapy. And I'm very pleased to show that those patients who received the lower dose of radiotherapy had the equivalent loco-regional failure to those who were treated standardly. So effectively what we're saying here is the lower dose of radiotherapy is as effective as the higher standard dose. And that's important in terms of potential for long-term control. And there are other slightly more subtle points which are important here. It means that patients that have to travel a long way don't have to come on 5 fewer occasions. And that in itself is important. We're having patients that travel up to 100 to 200 miles a day to come for radiotherapy. terms of toxicities, when we start to look at standard and lower dose, we're more interested predominantly in those higher, more significant toxicities, such as which we would grade as grade 2 and grade 3. And what you can see is effectively, though there were a significant amount of side effects in both groups, there was a slightly higher incidence of grade 3 and grade 4 side effects in those patients who had higher doses or the standard dose of radiotherapy. In terms of response to treatment, this is a difficult thing to measure clinically because immediately after radiotherapy, the whole area around the anus is very sore. We use, as do other groups, MRI at 3 months and at 6 months. And what you can see here is that effectively there is no difference in terms of the complete response rate between those patients treated with a standard dose of radiotherapy and those receiving a reduced dose of radiotherapy. So response at 3 months after the completion of chemoradiotherapy shows that the reduced dose is as good as the standard dose. Disease-free survival, that is the chance of the cancer coming back at any stage. Again, I'm pleased to show that there is no significant difference between the two groups in terms of disease-free survival, and that's measured between the beginning and the end of the trial. Overall survival, often difficult to do with a small tumor, but again, at this stage we can show no difference in terms of overall survival. And in fact, if one looks at this, the predominant number of deaths, and there are very few, is due to diseases unrelated to the treatment, the anal cancer the patient was treated for. So what we've shown is that a reduced dose of radiotherapy is as good as a standard dose of radiotherapy for those patients who have a small tumor. Moving forward then, is this better for patients? Do patients feel better? Is there a substantive improvement in terms of how they feel? And to do this, we've used a number of analyses. We've used 2 of the EORTC quality of life analyses, one of which was being used in a trial for the first time, and that's the ANL27 study. It was validated earlier this year. And effectively, what we can see is, in general, we got a good compliance in terms of return of the question as we asked. And you can see really there is no massive obvious difference in the quality of life scores. Patients after their treatment will obviously not feel so well, but that picks up quite quickly. And what you can see here is that if there are any differences, they're several, if not many months out from the initial treatment. The scores during treatment remain pretty standard. So again, there's nothing much to see within this particular group of analyses. But if we start to look into more specific anal cancer treatments, what we can see is those patients who got the slightly reduced dose of radiotherapy actually didn't feel quite as bad at the completion of the radiotherapy and weren't quite as unwell at 3 and 6 months after the treatment had been completed. In terms of bowel function, again, there is no significant difference. One of the things I should emphasize at this stage is what we're really talking about here are acute side effects of chemoradiotherapy. We're not talking about the long-term side effects, which we anticipate may be slightly better for those patients treated with the reduced dose. Again, you can see there is some difference in terms of sexual function, particularly within women. But this is very much dependent on when the reports are returned and how many people feel confident to report. And there are obviously a number of precursors to this, not just the fact that they've had chemoradiotherapy to their pelvis. Again, the same can be said, is exactly the same for men as well. So, What we've shown, I hope, is that the lower dose of chemoradiotherapy is as effective as the standard dose. The initial short-term side effects are lower with the reduced dose. And at the moment, patients are all reporting an excellent long-term quality of life. Long-term side effects to date are similar in both groups, but there is a hint that those patients treated with the reduced dose actually have better bowel and sexual side functions later on. Thank you very much.